It really isn't peak Fortnite until I've taught you 3 different ways you can have conversations with gnomes. Yeah, gnomes. Hey everyone, this is Syntax, and today I'm going to be teaching you guys how to have conversations with props in Fortnite Creative, or the more technical term is just cycling text. So we can see the first example here. I just go up to the gnome and talk to him. He's like, "What's up, Syntax?" So that is the most basic example. The second example is me talking, and he says, "Hello, Syntax, how are you?" And then I can answer, "I'm good, Mr. Gnome, how are you?" And then he'll respond with, "I'm great, Syntax, thanks for asking." And then the last example is me talking to the gnome. He's saying, "Hello, Syntax, how are you?" And you can see on the screen the text pop up. It says, "I'm good, Mr. Gnome, how are you?" And then his text cycle that says, "I'm good, Syntax, thanks for asking." Let's look at how to do all these. In the first example, the simplest example, it is simply a button being pressed and displaying text once you've sent a signal to that channel. As you can see, I have my button on my gnome right here with a radius of 0.5. All it has is delay and reset delay set to none. The trigger sound is disabled, is enabled on game start, and my cover text is talk. And I have the visibility off, and it is sending a signal that will, when interacted with, transmit on channel 1, which is what is helping display this text right here. Is actually not visible right now, but if I turn it to enable during phase all, you can see that the hello syntax is there. But turning that to none will make sure it doesn't get displayed until you set text visible when receiving from channel 1. And that is how you have the simplest form of talking to props. The second example I showed you guys is a little more complex, and I'm going to get into why, so just stick with me here. First button you use to initially talk to the gnome is exactly the same. It's enabled on game start. You have everything turned off. Its interaction text is talk. Interaction radius is 0.5, except when interacted with, transmit on channel 2. Now this is the first line of text that I want to have displayed from the gnome when I'm talking to him. So this is transmitting onto a channel where it is the first thing the gnome says. The billboard actually isn't visible right now, but as you can see, I select it and it says, "Hello, Syntax, how are you?" And this is being set visible when receiving from that same channel that the button is on. So you remember it's on channel 2, it's setting text visible when receiving from channel 2 as well. Now what happens after this is actually another button that is placed on the gnome. As you can see, there's the first button on the bottom. This second button is going to get enabled when receiving from the same channel that initial button is sending a signal to. What I mean by that is this button is initially disabled on game start. I'll show you guys that right now. It is disabled on game start, but it's going to be enabled when receiving from that same channel, which is channel 2, and when interacted with, this is going to transmit on channel 3. Now what does this do? Well, on one hand, that transmission to channel 3 is going to set the initial text hidden again, so we're not going to be able to say what the gnome, or we're not going to be able to see what the gnome said initially, but it is also going to set the next bit of text visible. So as you can see, it says set text visible when receiving from channel 3, and this is obviously the answer to me asking the question, "I'm great, Syntax, thanks for asking." Now where did I ask the question? Well, what's great about this example is your button interaction text for the preceding buttons is actually you as the character in the game asking the question. So my interaction text for this top button is obviously just me asking the question, or answering his question and then asking another question, because it's a conversation that goes back and forth. So I say, "I'm good, Mr. Gnome, how are you?" And that's simply just the interaction text of the button. So I don't actually have to have any messages pop up that has me asking a question. I'm just asking the question by pushing the button. Sorry if that was a lot. An important thing to note about having conversations set up like this is you're going to want to stagger the text, or else it's going to do some really weird blinking, glitching stuff. So as you can see, I have the first response set in the back there, and I kind of 32 snap the second response. You really just have to stagger it like a few pixels and it will be fine. But yeah, make sure you stagger it so there's no weird, like, glitchy, buggy things happening with your text. So yeah, let's look at the last example. In this last example I'm about to show you guys, we're actually reverting back to one button. As you can see, it's pretty similar. It's the exact same setup as that first button. It says talk. I just have this set up on channel 4, and then obviously it sends a signal to set text visible. Oh wait, I think that's the wrong. Is this the right one? Yes. "Hello, Syntax, how are you?" So that button sends a signal to channel 4, and this sets text visible when receiving from 4. Now, where this example differs is the fact that my version of the text is actually popping up via a HUD message device. So I'm not using the button interaction text to ask or answer questions. It's actually popping up via its own text in a HUD message device. So basically what's happening is when I send a signal on channel 4, which is setting the first initial set of text visible, it is sending a signal to this trigger that will trigger in exactly 3 seconds. So I have this trigger set up so that all this stuff is turned off, and I have it timed to trigger 1, and as you can see, the delay there is 3 seconds. So when I send a signal to this trigger, 3 seconds later it's going to send a signal to this HUD message device that says display the text. I'll just show you guys right here. As you can see, it's triggering when receiving from 4 and when triggered transmit on channel 5. So as you remember, the button sends a signal to 4. 3 seconds later, this sends a signal to 5, which is in the HUD message device. As you can see, I have the message that I am going to be saying right here. It says, "I'm good, Mr. Gnome, how are you?" So that is what the in-game character or myself is going to be saying. And I gave it 3-second display time. I figured I tried to give 1 second per every 10 characters. I figured that was good enough. So 3 seconds look good for me. Just make sure to turn the play sound off, place it wherever you want, doesn't really matter. But as you can see, it's showing when receiving from 5. So the button sends a signal to the trigger. 3 seconds later, sends a signal to the HUD message device. Now, as soon as this sends a signal to the HUD message device, it sends another signal to a different trigger, which is this trigger over here. This trigger is set up the exact same as the trigger preceding this. So instead of trigger when receiving from 4 and when trigger transmit on 5, it is just one more channel after. As you can see, the same delay, same everything, but it is trigger when receiving from 5 and when trigger transmit on channel 6. So as soon as this trigger sends a signal to the HUD message device, 3 seconds later this will send a signal to channel 6, which is doing 2 things. The first thing that trigger is doing is sending a signal to set the Gnome's response text visible. So as you remember, it sends a signal to channel 6, so I'm setting the response visible when receiving from 6, and obviously it says, "I'm good, Syntax, thanks for asking." The second thing that trigger is doing is sending a signal to channel 6 to have this initial text be hidden. So you remember he said, "Hello, Syntax, how are you?" We want that to go away when he's giving us his response to our question. So it's going to send a signal to channel 6, which is going to set that initial text invisible. Sorry if you didn't get all that. This mechanic is actually a little more complicated to explain than I thought it was going to be, but if you did everything right, it should look something like this. So if you remember, our first button that's set up just talks and then it sets text visible. Our second example, we're going to talk, it sets the text visible, and then my response is with the second button text. So I say, "I'm good, Mr. Gnome, how are you?" Sets this text invisible and the new text visible. And our last example is just one button. His message pops up. 3 seconds later, my answer and my question pops up. And then 3 seconds later, this disappears and his answer pops up. So yeah, that's what it all looks like. Anyway, guys, that is how you properly cycle text or have conversations with props in Fortnite Creative. I hope you guys find this useful and you can find some way to use it in your up-and-coming maps. And yeah, this has been Syntax. Later.